What if America's 20th century wars weren't isolated conflicts, but parts of one long struggle? A global contest of ideas, fear, and survival. A war that began in the trenches of World War I and didn't truly end until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. It began in 1917. World War I had been raging for 3 years when the United States entered. We were pulled in by German aggression, attacks on our ships, threats to our borders. We didn't come for empire or glory, we came to restore order. The war ended in 1918 with the defeat of Germany. But the peace that followed was fragile. The Treaty of Versailles punished Germany harshly. Instead of stability, it created resentment. And across Europe and Asia, old empires collapsed and new ideologies filled the vacuum. America returned home, stronger but cautious. We avoided entanglements. We hoped the world would sort itself out. It didn't. In the 1930s, fascism rose from the ruins of war. Germany rearmed under Hitler. Japan invaded China. Italy marched into Africa. By 1941, the world was on fire again. And when Japan struck Pearl Harbor, America rejoined the fight. Not for conquest, but to stop it. World War II was a fight for survival. Democracy against dictatorship, freedom against tyranny. We helped defeat the Axis powers, alongside allies, including the Soviet Union. But victory didn't bring unity. It brought new divisions. The world split into two camps, East and West. Two superpowers both shaped by war, both determined never to be vulnerable again. The Soviet Union, devastated by Nazi invasion, wanted a buffer, a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. The United States, determined to avoid another global catastrophe, believed peace required freedom and open societies. Neither side trusted the other. The Cold War had begun. In 1950, it turned hot in Korea. North Korea invaded the South, backed by China and the Soviet Union. The United States and its allies responded not for territory, but to stop the spread of communism. Korea became the first test of American resolve. It wasn't about conquest, it was about containment, drawing a line and holding it. 3 years later, an armistice ended the fighting, but not the war. The Korean peninsula remains divided to this day. Then came Vietnam. What began as a colonial struggle between France and a local independence movement became a Cold War flashpoint. The US feared that if Vietnam fell to communism, others in Southeast Asia would follow. The domino theory became doctrine. We didn't seek to control Vietnam. We sought to defend an ally and preserve a balance of power. But the war dragged on, and the cost grew for both nations and families. Back home, Americans asked hard questions. Why were we there? Could we win? And what would victory even mean? The Soviet Union, too, was learning hard lessons. It backed communist movements abroad, but struggled with its own economy and growing resistance in its sphere. In time, it would face its own Vietnam in Afghanistan. For both sides, the Cold War was a long and costly commitment, not just in lives, but in trust, in diplomacy, in humanity. It was a war of proxy battles, nuclear standoffs, and deep-rooted fear. But neither side wanted true war. Not once the nuclear age began. Mutually assured destruction, MAD, made direct conflict unthinkable. So instead, the war played out in Korea, in Vietnam, in Berlin, in Cuba, in space. A war of influence, of ideas, of who would shape the future. And slowly, that future began to take shape. In the 1980s, cracks began to show. The Soviet Union, stretched thin and burdened by internal pressure, began to shift. Reform movements rose. Barriers began to fall. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, the Cold War's most visible symbol, came down. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. Not with a bang, but with exhaustion. That's when the long war truly ended. From World War I to the Cold War's close, America's role evolved. We didn't always get it right. Neither did the Soviets. But both nations were shaped by fear, of tyranny, of chaos, of defeat. Both believed they were fighting for something bigger than borders. The United States believed in protecting freedom. The Soviet Union believed in building a different kind of world. And for nearly a century, those two visions collided again and again. But out of that long war came lessons about power and about restraint and about the cost of fear left unchecked. This wasn't a story of good versus evil. It was a story of survival, of nations learning, through hardship, how to coexist. Today we live in the shadow of that century, with its mistakes, its triumphs, its warnings. Because history doesn't just repeat itself. Sometimes it never really ends, until someone finally lays down their sword.